Hi, this is Kat for Lightwave Digital. Happy Halloween in 2025. And in this video installment, we're going to have a little bit of a Halloween themed shot that we're going to also discuss Lightwave's volumetric system. Recently, on some of the different groups on Facebook and in Discord, there have been some complaints about Lightwave's volumetric speed, and I'm here to kind of dispel some of those rumors or myths and give you a breakdown of the different types of volumetrics that you can use just in the basic sense and just how fast they actually are. In this scene, what we've got are a flashlight and a flashlight vol. I've broken them out so I have more control over them. And we just have this flashlight moving the scene as we move with our camera, doing a push in. And to give an example of what that light looks like, we're going to turn that flashlight vol and flashlight itself on, one being parented to the other. And let's just take a look at what's actually involved in this light. First one, obviously, it's going to be set to pretty high lumens. This actually makes sense based off of the distance the light is from the back wall here. And it's basically a spotlight, nothing scary. It is not affecting volumetrics, that's being taken care of the one below it. And we do have what is known as a light cookie or a gobo in the projection image. This gives the light a little bit of a texture or shape. So let's just take a look at what that looks like in the image editor so you can get an idea of what I'm talking about. So I have a number of different cookies that I use typically. This one's pretty good for a flashlight, but I can replace it and you get an idea of what that one looks like. So here's one that's a spotlight. This might be a little bit better. Gives that little central bulb and kind of a distorted look on the edge of the lens. And this is probably pretty good. Now, the reason for the 2400 lumens is just we used to have in Lightwave 2015 or in previous versions to that a function of percentage, and you would throw light based off of that function of percentage. It wasn't based on an accurate model. Since we've switched over to the physical-based render engine, the method of lighting has changed. So we're no longer dealing in factors of 100%. We're dealing in lumens or lux. So let's go and take a look at our edit nodes. There's nothing in here really. I was doing the volumetric settings in this light, but I decided for maximum control to separate it out. So let's go down to the other light and also make sure that it has either the spotlight cookie selected or no selection so that it doesn't affect the light that's being thrown through it in a volumetric sense. Now this one does have some volumetric settings. It does have effect volumetric set, and it does have the same node setup, but it's actually not connected to anything. I don't actually need to use the volumetric light tools in here to get something that I want. So just right off the bat, let's take a look at what this looks like in VPR. And we'll see that we don't really have much once it does kick in. And the reason for that is that we need something for the light to cast through, and that is achieved through enabling the use of volumetric scattering and turning on the enable volumetrics. Okay, so what we've got here is a situation where we have a scattering weight and an asymmetric value. The asymmetry value basically controls how much of the volume that is basically global throughout this is being affected by light. Now there is another item in here that I've got that I'm going to turn off just really quickly, and I'm going to show you what that looks like with it off. So basically this is just the volumetric light on its own working with the volumetric scattering, and we punch this up to a really, really high 0.9. You can see that it almost completely eliminates it. 0.5 is kind of the middle ground. Doesn't look too bad. And this volumetric light also in the background up here is the volumetric effect being cast by the key light. So it's affecting volumetrics, and I can turn that off. All right, let's turn that on. Now this is VPR. VPR obviously is not the total production render, even though it can be used as a production render. It's not doing all the super heavy lifting underneath of it that a normal production or F9 or F10 or discriminant render would work through. So let's do an F9 with this and take a look at how quickly this actually renders. Granted, I'm only using an anti-aliasing of 2 and 2 with adaptive sampling, but once it goes through all the mesh update stuff, it's going to power through this render very quickly. And we'll see that we can get actually a very nice result with volumetrics in here very quickly. Two volumetric lights, one being that distant light, one being that spotlight, without much heavy lifting. So in just under 30 seconds, probably 25 seconds, we've got a render result that's not, in my opinion, production ready. I'd go up a little bit more, but by all means, the volumetrics are not what's slowing this down in any way, what shape or form. So just to demonstrate that, I'm going to go and turn the volumetrics off. We'll do another render here. And this will obviously be quicker, but we're going to get a render result that's effectively similar to what we had, but without that beautiful volumetric light, and it doesn't really sell. So having the volumetrics in there certainly helps out. And you can see that this is still going to clock in at just over 20 seconds. So about 5 seconds of that render is consumed by the volumetric effect, and we get that much nicer of a result with the volumetric effect. So if we use the page up and page down key when we're in the image render view, we can see the results of those two renders back and forth. So our first render with the volumetric effect on, which of course took 24.7 seconds, and with the volumetric render disabled at 20.6. So just under 3 point whatever seconds to get a really nice volumetric look. Now that's all fine and dandy. That's just basically volumetric lights doing something here. But I want to talk about that mist. And also what we can also add is fog type. So by enabling a fog type and turning your volumetrics back on, we can see that the background is now being illuminated or being shaded because it's got fog. This is kind of infinite distance in the background. So we're going to have fog working for us there. So if I reduce my fog distance down to like, say 20 meters, and we pull this back to like 5 meters, so it's closer to camera, you can see the difference that this makes. So we've got a kind of a foggy atmosphere, but what we're lacking here is texture to that fog. It's just kind of a realistic fog effect, but there's no kind of mist and twirls or tendrils in it. So how do we achieve that? Well, this is where we get into the other side of volumetrics and Lightwave, which isn't just lights or fog or asymmetric scattering or whatever it might be. What we want is a fog volumetric object. Now to visualize this, I need to go into the shaded texture view, and we're going to go to perspective view, and I'm going to just navigate around here for a second. All right, and we're going to go and turn on our mist so that's enabled. Okay, so what we're looking at right now, that mist is represented by this voluminous cube. It's kind of a grayish cube, and it's picking up the color from what this actual mist object is doing. And this mist object is actually a primitive type of volumetric, and we've called it mist, and that's the volumetric effect being assigned to a null, and we're representing it as a cube. We can also do it as a sphere or a cone, something similar like that. There are uses for this, but I'll get into another tutorial with that one. And we basically want the radius for this to be about 30 meters. So we've got the camera actually encapsulated by this volume. And that is generally a no-no in a lot of volumetric systems, because camera frustrums and the actual camera plane sometimes can't figure out where they are in type of inside of a volumetric effect, and that can cause a renderer to slow down. Years and years ago, we used to have this problem with general hypervoxels where we couldn't actually tell which side of a hypervoxel the item was on for the camera, so it was getting confused. It would render really slow and just be a nightmare to try to render. But in 2018 plus, where we had this new volumetric system introduced, it's actually much faster, and this is supposed to be technically the replacement for hypervoxels, but it became something else, and it's actually quite robust and has the ability to do a lot of really great things. Now, there is texture on this. We've got a simple turbulence texture on here. I'm going to bring up the values for it so you can see what it is. And you can actually see this labeled as hypervoxel primitive. So you can see what the heritage is behind this. Now, this has got a small scale factor of 0.025, contrast is 75%, just to give it some tooth. And a number of frequencies is 5, gives it a little bit more tendril look. And we've got a scale of 2 by 1.5 and 2 on the X, Y, and Z, and we've got a little bit of position change here that's been driven through the use of envelopes. And where's my graph editor? Oh, here we are. So it's just changing on each of those axes over the course of time. So we've got some animated change over time. Not too much, just enough to give it a foggy look. And by foggy look, let's go back to the camera view and you'll see what I mean by that. So re-enabling VPR. Move this stuff out of the way. VPR will update itself. And now you'll notice that I've got kind of a ground fog going on here. Now I'm going to eliminate the fog type, just get rid of it, so you can see just that volumetric effect from the mist object in action. So you can now see it. I'm going to just toggle it on and toggle it off so you can see the difference. Okay, so that's with it off. And now you can see it with it on. Okay, now because this has a procedural running through the cubic volume, and we also have a gradient that's applied to this, we can change how this behaves, looks, where its presence is. We have quite a bit of control over this. And this is just scratching the surface, really. What I was after was basically a kind of ground fog that would be coming up from the graves here and just slightly crawl up the wall without going too much up the side of it. But you can see that very quickly you can get something that looks really, really nice. Now, if that's a little too dense for you, then you can just back that off. And it looks pretty good. Now, you can't see this in motion because we don't have a render in motion. So let's go and check out the render that I did for this in motion. Now, you'll have to bear with me as I go and grab this, because I did do some previs renders of this. But unfortunately, I have a lot of other stuff on my screen that is unable to be shown. So I'm going to do this off to the side and bring up the actual video. Okay, getting there. All right, let's take a look at these two demos. Now, this first one, it's a little over compressed, but you can see the fog being animated over in the underside, and it's got some really heavy compression here because I was just using the default value of, I think, 40 or 50%. But you can see it's animated, and that volumetric light passes over top of the wall. And this was rendered directly out of VPR, and each time I rendered it was full 100 frames, and it took just a few minutes to actually render that out. Now, I changed the settings for it, and then came up with this. Obviously, this is with the camera push in, and the volumetric effect is a little bit less pronounced and a little bit slower to travel through with that procedural on an envelope going through the actual dimensions of the cube. So whenever somebody tells you that Lightwave's volumetrics are slow, it always has the caveat of depends on what you're doing. In this particular case, I've got a volumetric light. I've got the volumetric mist effect, which is through the render system via the primitive type volumetric, and or with the addition of realistic fog. So I can combine all three of those together, hit F9, and we're going to get a pretty nice result with all three of those types of volumetric effects combined. From the volumetric lights, being that spotlight, the distant light, which is the key light in the background here, which is kind of emulating moonlight, plus the fog effect on the ground. Now, typically I would not render a volumetric effect like this in its own shot with all the other beauty passes and everything else. I would break that out and render it as a separate element and then composite it together. And the reason for that is just I can change that effect after the fact. Maybe the director wants the fog to be super, super slow motion, or maybe we want to add something else into it, maybe make it more finely detailed, whatever it might be, and then I don't have to render the whole thing over again. And I can just render this particular element out separately, composite it back in a compositing program, and I can make those changes anytime I want without actually having to render the whole thing all over. So in under 56 seconds, 57 seconds, we've got all of those three types of effects combined, and we don't really have to. Actually, it's four different types of effects. It's the volumetric lights, it's the fog, it's the mist, and of course, well, three. So there you go. Let's change this up a little bit. Obviously, if you need a render that's a little bit cleaner than that, it's going to give you the option to do so in the volumetric samples for a particular light. Okay. So let's say your flashlight needs to be a little bit more intense and more exciting. And we want some more volumetric samples involved, so it's cleaner. You can crank that up. Okay. And we can just see the results of that. So let's go to there's your volumetric transmittance. So you can see all the effect of that in there. Let's go volumetric light, which you can get as a separate buffer. So you can just see these two volumetric lights, the effects of it. Okay. Nothing really there for emission because nothing's actually emitting, but we can see the mist object in here just barely. Let's turn normalize on here. See if we can get that a little better. And you can see what that misty volumetric effect is actually doing. So by rendering these elements out separately, you have maximum control over them, and if necessary, you can go into just that particular element, render only that, and get your shot out the door faster as a composited element that you can change. But even with all those things combined, it's still not going to take hours and hours to render a frame like this. It'll take, under a minute. Granted, depends on what you're doing. Camera properties for this, for me, I would probably be somewhere in the range of 8 and 4 if I'm going to render with motion blur. If not, probably get away with like maybe 1 and 8. Let's turn the motion blur off here and go to 1. And we'll go back to final render, turn our normalized display off. There's one other factor that's involved here to give it this look. So we're going to go to scene, image processing, and that's the tone mapping. So without the tone mapping, and I'll get into the actual settings of this in a second, we get something that's a little bit more natural inside of the render engine, but maybe we're looking for a filmic look, which obviously can be treated in post. But if you want to go to ACES Filmic, you certainly can. Change your exposure. Reinhard, different algorithms for a different type of look. Change to the linear. You start dialing in your exposure, so 1.25. Get a really nice look there. Let's go back to Filmic where I had it before. Change our cutoff to like 1.5. Now it's really bright. Let's go 8. Makes it look deep and scary. Obviously, we don't want things that are being, rendered out to super black. So let's go 2. So we can see the back side of this object. And if necessary, we can darken in comp right down to the very limits of whatever our output color space is in color format. But we've got everything that we need in here. Now, the reason why I would want to split this out into 2 separate passes with the volumetrics, as I stated before, is obviously I've got the ability to tweak it after the fact with the separate elements, but also you'll find that if you render those elements out separately, Depending on frame load times over a network and the actual render times, you can actually up the quality of your volumetric effect and reduce the amount of effort that is needed for the render of the actual objects under their own lighting conditions, and crank up the quality settings when you don't need to for the rest of the shot. So we don't need to up the quality settings for the rest of this if we need it for the volumetric pass. And one of the things about volumetrics is that sometimes underneath of certain types of volumetric effects, you will see that certain surfaces don't get all the attention that they need in the adaptive sampling system. So if you have little sparklies like these and you need to fix them, you're going to have to throw more samples at the light, the surface, or raw adaptive sampling in the camera, and of course global settings to get rid of some of those little nasty bits. But with this type of anti-aliasing that we've got applied here, let's see what happens. And granted, these are still just standard surfaces. I did not convert them to principal BSDF, so I have better control over this stuff. But you can see that we can get a nice render out of this. All of our edges are very smooth. And we've got our volumetrics in here. And for a 1920 by 1080, or 1920 by 860, which was our render resolution on the Asylum shows for the most part, and then we blow it up to 4K. It comes off the block within a pretty reasonable amount of time. I would have no problems rendering those out as a 2-minute per frame shot, depending on how long it is, whatever it might be. But I would still typically break this out into 2 passes at least, one for all of our lighting and then 2 for the volumetric effects. Because I guarantee you, some director's going to say, oh, it's too foggy or it's not foggy enough, or I want the fog to travel at a different speed or something of that nature. So I might as well render that as a separate element. But you can see the final results here, minute 53 seconds for that frame resolution. Granted, the assets are what they are, but the point is that we have volumetrics in here. They're not slow by any means, and we have the desired effect that we're looking for. Now, that demonstrates the following. We've obviously got volumetrics in the physically based world. We have fog type. We're working with it in a volumetric scattering environment. So that's kind of like the medium that we're working through. We also have volumetric lights from the spotlight and our distant light, which is emulating the moon. And then, of course, our volumetric primitive, which is giving us that ground fog over top of the graves. So all combined, we have a number of different visual effects in the form of volumetrics that are working in type of inside of this render. And if we just turn it all off, let's see what we get for speed. Still going to come out probably about 20 something seconds. 17.9 seconds. So obviously when we want to start cranking things up with the anti-aliasing, the volumetric effect is going to benefit the most or drag the shot the most based off those settings. So things to consider. No, volumetrics are not slow in Lightwave. That's all relative. Depends on what you're doing, and you're going to be able to mix and throw a number of different types of volumetric effects at a render. So depending on what you need and what you don't need, the combination could be what's the slowdown, if there is one even, or it just may be that you need to render that stuff separately out so that you have control over it. And Lightwave gives you that flexibility. As you saw in the demonstration here, we have all these different buffers that are examples, and you can break these out into light groups if you want to. There's a fantastic video that I do on light groups on the Lightwave 3D YouTube channel. And you can break these out as element scene types, light types to different scenes, render them over the network, and you can build up your shot as it comes off the render stack. So by no means is this slow. And this is just a quick demonstration, but it does demonstrate the fact that you can have volumetric primitives, which some people feel might be the slowest. But again, as I said before, we've got the camera encapsulated in this effect. So that's not part of the situation. We've got our volumetric lights. We've got realistic fog. All coming together with volumetric primitive. That's not a slowdown. We're doing a heck of a lot more under the hood and giving you the flexibility of making all of that work together much more easily. And that's all because of the modern render engine. All right, thank you very much. We hope you enjoyed this video. There are more in this series, of course. Make sure you check out the entire Lightwave channel. There are subject matter videos on a lot of these things individually, but we certainly hope you enjoyed it, and happy Halloween.